Good evening and welcome to an Interfaith Works virtual community conversation. I'm Rosetta Robinson, the facilitator for tonight's conversation. In our work at Interfaith Works, we have supporting faith communities and other communities that are involved in our mission. And so we're holding these virtual conversations to keep them informed about our work and also to make sure that we bring them information about significant pressing issues that affect the work we do, um, supporting and undergirding those who are in need in our county. Tonight, our focus, of course, as you know, is on policing. We're pleased that we'll have public officials and community experts, and you, our audience, our friends and neighbors, who will be able to join us for our conversation. So, we have a wonderful group of experts, and we've got their biographical information summarized, and we will be showing that on the screen shortly. I'm going to ask Matthew McGinnity on our staff to give you a few little instructions about how we're going to be handling the webinar this evening.
Matthew?
Thanks, Dr. Robinson. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. So happy that you could come. We're really excited about this event tonight, and we hope that it's very informative and powerful for all of you guys. We are going to have a moment or a portion of our webinar tonight to ask questions to our panelists. And there is a question and answer function. If you hover over your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A box. And if you click that, you should be able to ask questions. There is also a chat box function. If that is able to be accessed by you, please also, you can use that as well to submit a question to the panelists. We will be reserving time at the end to answer those questions that you may have. So if you submit a question early, we will try to do our best to track it down and make sure that we find it. But just keep that in mind that at the end of this webinar will be dedicated to answering the questions. Dr. Robinson, back to you.
Thank you. So we're going to begin with a presentation from the Montgomery County Office of Legislative Oversight, and the office, OLO, its acronym, is an office connected with the Montgomery County Council. And we're pleased that Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, Senior Legislative Analyst, and Natalia Carrizosa, Legislative Analyst, is here to provide highlights from the study. So we're going to begin with Natalia. Natalia, can you just share with us about the study, the research, and what prompted you going into this study and this report for the Montgomery County Council?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I'm going to be showing a few slides this evening. Here we go. So my name is Natalia Carrizosa. I'm here from the County Council's Office of Legislative Oversight. We really appreciate Reverend Dr. Robinson for providing this opportunity for me to describe OLO's MCPD Policing Data and Best Practices Report, or OLO Report 2020-9. Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins and I authored this report, which was requested by Councilmember Jawando. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background on the Office of Legislative Oversight, or OLO. Our mission is to provide accurate information, analysis, and independent findings and recommendations that help the County Council fulfill its legislative oversight function. And when I say legislative oversight, this includes the monitoring the performance of publicly funded activities and applying this knowledge to the Council's primary functions of enacting laws, establishing public policy, approving budgets, and raising revenues. And each year, OLO publishes a dozen or more reports on county-funded agencies at the request of the County Council. Sorry, I skipped forward. These reports are available online on our website, and the URL is up there on the screen. So going back to the report we're going to be discussing tonight, OLO Report 2020-9, this report specifically responds to the County Council's request for us to review and describe MCPD, that's the Montgomery County Police Department's data sets and data practices. Given the council's focus on community policing, racial equity, and social justice, this report highlights MCPD's data sets that describe their interactions with the public, meaning policing data. So in other words, we're focused in this report more on policing data than, for example, crime statistics. And we analyzed several sources of information, including research literature on policing data best practices, annual reports of policing data from state and local sources, as well as interviews with MCPD leadership and staff. And from all of this information that we gathered, we identified 5 key project findings. The first is that best practices recommends collecting and monitoring policing data to advance constitutional and community policing. Our second and third findings are that MCPD tracks several policing data points and that several MCPD data sets align with best practices. Our fourth project finding is that MCPD internal data sets usually offer more information than annual reports or Data Montgomery, which is the county's open data platform, particularly with regard to describing data trends by race and ethnicity. And then our fifth project finding, which is the focus of my presentation this evening, is that disparities by race and ethnicity are evident in MCPD interactions with the public. So on this slide, we look at some of the available data on disparities that show that there are wide disparities in police interactions by race and ethnicity. So for example, although African Americans accounted for 18% of the county's population, they accounted for 32% of MCPD traffic stops in 2018, 44% of MCPD arrests in 2017, and 57% of MCPD use of force incidents in 2019. These are some examples that we gleaned from the public annual reports that MCPD publishes to provide the council with some further examples of the types of analysis that could be done with the data that MCPD collects. We delved a little bit more deeply into a data set on the county's open data platform, Data Montgomery. That is a data set on traffic violations. So it lists traffic violations of drivers stopped in Montgomery County by the Montgomery County Police Department. So this data set includes race and ethnicity, as well as the gender for drivers that were stopped for traffic violations. And so it offers several avenues for analysis of police interactions with the public. So we looked at this data set in a couple of different ways. The first thing that we did is look at the number of traffic stops by race, ethnicity, and gender as a percentage of population of each group in the county. And so we see from this data that there are wide disparities in rates of traffic stops. For example, the number of stops of Black women represented 18% of the population of Black women in the county, while the number of stops of Black men represented about 38% of the population of Black men in the county. And then for comparison, the number of stops of white women in 2019 was 10% of the population of white women in the county. And the number of stops of white men represented 17% of the population of white men. Two caveats to this are that an individual can be stopped more than once. So a rate of 17% does not necessarily mean that 17% of white men were stopped in 1 year. And then additionally, some drivers may be residents of other jurisdictions. The data set is not limited to drivers that are residents of Montgomery County. Another way to look at traffic stops is the number of violations per stop. It is common for police to cite drivers with more than one violation during a single stop. And we found that, oops, it looks like I'm missing, oops, I'm sorry about that. So this particular slide looks, as I said, looks at the number of violations per stop. We found that Black and Latinx drivers were less likely than white drivers to receive just one violation during a stop, and more likely to receive 4 or more violations during a stop. And then we also looked at the types of violations by race and ethnicity, and we found that the distribution of violations by race and ethnicity varied widely by the type of violation. Overall, violations related to actions taken while driving, such as speeding or failing to stop when required, tended to match the county's population more closely, meaning that we didn't see huge disparities by race and ethnicity. So for example, that top line that says exceeding the speed limit, that's the most common type of violation drivers were cited for. You can see that the distribution by race of the violations matches up pretty closely with the population data that's bolded at the top. Whereas if you look at the failure to display registration card upon demand by a police officer, then you see that the disparities are much larger. And then finally, we looked at searches conducted during traffic stops, and we found that Black and Latinx drivers were searched at higher rates than other groups, with 3.8% and 3.44% of stops respectively resulting in a search versus 1.6% of stops of white drivers. So based on our overall findings, the OLO report offered 6 recommendations for council action. Collectively, these recommendations recommend that MCPD track and report disaggregated data by race and ethnicity for all stops, including stop and frisk, citations, field interviews, and then also for resident and officer perceptions of police community relations and contacts. So this concludes my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Reverend Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, Natalia. This is very, very helpful. And so I know that you and your colleague spent some good time looking through a lot of facts and data. So now I want to just get a sense from, and I'll turn to Dr. Bonner-Tompkins. Based on the research you did, were you surprised by any of the findings?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and appreciate the opportunity to comment on our report. There were some surprises in the report from my perspective. I was really surprised when you look at the traffic data, it's so comprehensive. I was surprised that a lot of the other data that the police department collects is not quite as comprehensive. In particular, I was surprised that they're not tracking stop and frisk data or other street stop data that does not result in an arrest, citation, or summons. I was surprised about a lack of an electronic database for criminal and civil citations that are issued by Montgomery County Police Department officers. We were surprised also about some of the inconsistency in how ethnicity is reported, so that it's clear when you're looking at a data point that for folks who are listed as white, distinguishing between those who are Latinx versus white non-Hispanic. And then I was also surprised about there not being sort of a regular reporting either in Data Montgomery or just to the public around arrest data by race and ethnicity, that's information that has to be requested versus being routinely reported.
You know, as you share that, and the researcher, I appreciate the fact that sometimes, you know, when we're doing research, we expect certain things, and then other times, you know, we're surprised. I'm always interested in what a researcher, how he or she would comment on that. So, OLO has five or six recommendations. So, if we know that the county might not be able to implement all of them, what would you say should be the priority? What would you recommend?
So, that's a great question, and it's a difficult question in the sense that we offered all six of those recommendations, you know, as a collective in terms of aligning, recommending that the police department align its practices to best practices. I mean, really the recommendations are around two issues. One is just a collection of more data by race and ethnicity on police interactions with the public and doing that consistently. And then the second broad recommendation is for the police department to increase its capacity to use this policing data to advance best practices in community and constitutional policing, sort of analogous to the investment that they've made in using investigative data to focus on crime reduction. So that's why we did those 6, that whole package. But my perspective is that any of those, the enactment of any of those recommendations would help the police department move towards those goals. So, I wouldn't prioritize any of the 6 at the same time. I would say implementing any of them would be useful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We would have been turning to the Senator Smith or Councilmember Will Jawando. And I would ask Matthew McGinnity to identify a few things in terms of those who might have joined since we began. But I think what we will do now is, I don't think the senator has joined us yet. So why don't we?
He's here.
I'm here. Hey,
Oh,
Doc.
I'm so sorry, Senator Smith. So, protocol dictates that we would start with you, Senator Smith, but I must say, I am so pleased. We are so pleased that we've got 2 distinguished legislators who are both focused on a very important legislative priority. Now, you've just heard the OLO report, and so that you cleared your schedules, because I know it's a busy evening, to be able to be with us. So what I'd like to do is begin with you, Senator Smith, and then Councilmember Jawando. I know you need to leave kind of early, and we hope that we'll be able to circle back to you momentarily. So, Senator Smith, I did send some questions to your staff, and I know that in your press release, you talked about the systemic injustices that have really plagued generations and folks in our community. And so I'm just wondering, you also said that you want to try to bridge the divides between law enforcement and our communities that they serve. That's not an easy task. So what in your own life or your role as a senator of District 20 of Silver Spring and Tacoma Park has made you want to take on this noble task, shall we say?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Reverend. And if I'm happy to go afoul of protocol if the council member needs to go, and it buttresses nicely with the report. So happy to see the time if you need to go. So we can do that if you want. But if not, I'll press on. But council member, if you got to go, let's rock and roll with that. And then
all right. Well, I'm going to then yield to Councilmember Jawando and have him speak, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you, Senator Smith.
That's the state and local working together,
That's good. That's good. We need to see that a lot, right?
And Senator Smith is my state senator, so I appreciate that. He's doing a great job. So thank you, Senator Smith.
Constituent services. There you go.
Awesome. So, I will say just on the last point, good to see everyone. Good evening. I'm Councilmember Will Jawando. I'm at-large member of the council, so I represent everyone in Montgomery County. And I'm on the Education and Culture Committee and the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee, but been very active on this issue of reimagining public safety and criminal justice reform for a number of years. In my life prior to this, working in the Obama White House and Department of Education, but also at the NAACP as a civil rights attorney, and growing up here as a young Black man in Montgomery County. And so I will say on the OLO report, just to button that up, that I requested that report, which I really appreciate, and Dr. Bonner-Tompkins and Ms. Carrizosa did a great job on that report, because we had some experience with difficulty trying to get certain data points, and realizing that some were collected in different ways. And one of those that was mentioned in the report is trespass orders that were collected, on paper at specific stations and had to be collated by the department, and took a lot of time, and based on some incidents that had happened, and we just kept asking questions. And so this report is really helpful, and I think to show some areas where we need some improvement on our data collection, but as well as the disparities that are apparent in the data, right? So there's the collection of the data itself and having it, and then using it to inform and improve police community relations and police practice. And I think if as you asked the question, Dr. Robinson, about being surprised, I think most people in Montgomery County don't know the data that was just gone over. and we didn't know that those disparities exist, but they do here in our great community. And so we actually I've drafted a bill along with the entire Public Safety Committee that will implement all of the recommendations in the OLO report. We'll be introducing that next month, and it will implement each one of those. That, you know, making sure we track the things that aren't being tracked, and use those to improve performance. That's in addition to all the work that the executive and Chief Jones are doing to analyze and do an audit of services and the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. And we just appointed a Police Advisory Commission. So there's a lot of work going on concurrently, you know, and as I've always said, and Senator Smith knows this as well, you don't fix or improve a system that has been built up over hundreds of years with like law enforcement in this country with the legacy that it has, and disentangle it from systemic racism like every system is, our healthcare system and any system. You don't do that overnight. That's going to take intentional work. It's going to take a lot of legislation. It's going to take a lot of culture change, and it's going to take a lot of data review and improved practice. So all that is going to take time. I wanted to mention just a couple of things that, in addition to that piece of legislation that I've worked on and that we are working on, we passed just recently a pretty landmark use of force bill that did address some of the most urgent things that we're seeing now, and why people were in the streets much of this year in response to the murder of George Floyd and killing of Breonna Taylor and Fanon Burhay here in Montgomery County and others across the country, where we have done a number of things. We banned chokeholds and striking individuals who are restrained. We codified a duty to intervene by officers when they witness another officer committing a crime or violating policy. We limited no-knock warrants dramatically in drug cases, which is the vast majority of where they happen. And very importantly, we raised the standard of when deadly force can be used from when it's reasonable to when it's absolutely necessary as a last resort after other alternatives have been used. And the chief is underway, I'm sure he'll tell you, in drafting a new use of force policy based on this new law that passed unanimously in the summer. And so that's one thing that we've done. We're also working on we just made appointments to the Police Advisory Commission, which is a 13-member body that will make recommendations to the council and the executive on how to improve police policy and practice. That is another big step. And then we're also working on a number of other initiatives. The final thing I'll mention before passing it to Senator Smith, a lot attention has been paid, rightly so, on the transparency and accountability. My first bill that I introduced was the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act back in January of 2019, seems like a lifetime ago, that called for independent investigations and public reporting when a police officer kills a resident. That is a Obama 21st Century Policing Task Force recommendation that I know Senator Smith and they are working on statewide. That passed here and is law. It was the first criminal justice reform legislation in the county in at least 20 years. Some people think ever, since the county was, this county council came into being in the 60s. And it shows that we have a lot of work to do. But transparency and accountability and use of force are all very important, but there are other things we have to do too around who we hire, what we train them to do, how long we train them, the psychological examinations that go along with these officers, where they live, how they interact with the community, what the incentive structure is. Are you just tracking arrests and stops and tickets, some of the things we just talked about in the OLO report, but can we find and create ways to track and reward and promote based on positive interactions? And what do we focus our crime efforts on? Do we focus on low-level offenses, and do we focus on traffic stops, or do we change the paradigm of what we focus on? I think there are larger questions about the system itself that we need to also address, while we address the most urgent questions of protecting life in deadly force situations and accountability when those do happen. And I just wanted to frame that because I think a lot of people focus, rightly so, on the use of force and the accountability after the fact. But there's a whole range of things on how we hire, what we track, how we promote, that we need to change as well. And that's going to take some work as well. So I'll pause there, and I appreciate you all having this conversation and happy to be a resource.
Excuse me, before you leave, I must ask you a personal question though,
Yes.
because given the data and given the social reality of these injustices and disparities that exist in Montgomery County, people would be surprised to know that you've been pulled over numerous times, that you received some hate mail, I believe, which related to your speaking up about racial profiling. But there was an article where in Bethesda Beat, you were quoted as saying that despite everything, you feel like, I feel like I'm at the exact right place where I'm supposed to be at the exact right time. Do you still feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, if you look at any change that's happened in the country, I feel we're all in the right place in the right time. It was never popular with everybody. Large swaths of people didn't like it. So I'm in a long line of people getting, and I'm not saying I have every right answer, but I'm working really hard to try to get to a vision of where we have trust, we have safety, we focus on the right things, we reprioritize and get police focused on things that they should be focused on. I think there's great agreement that, dealing with mental health issues, dealing with homelessness, we've asked our police to do too much and we've paid them too little to do it. And that's not, some people get mad at me for saying that. But then I say there should be high accountability and we should change the priorities of what they do focus on at the same time. And then some people get mad about that. I think there's a way to do this in a way that makes a stronger system for everybody. And I was pulled over. I haven't talked about this. I was pulled over on Saturday
Last past Saturday.
And I was asked, it wasn't by Montgomery County police officers, it was by a ICC highway patrol officer. And I was asked, do I have any guns or drugs in the car? The first thing I was asked. And then I got to engage with the officer and I said, well, why'd you ask me that? He said, well, there's certain things we look at for indicators of whether you have those things happen. And I said, well, what indicated? I was dressed in a suit, similar to I'm dressed today, a jacket and suit. And I said, what indicator for me looked like you needed to ask me those questions? He said, well, it could be random too. I said, okay, well, is it random or did you have an indicator? And I pressed because, and I explained to him, I said, that erodes trust. Unless you really have a reason to believe that, unless you ask every person that, and that's your protocol, we can argue about whether that'd be a good thing or not. You shouldn't do it randomly because we know the data that was just presented, that certain people get asked this and things happen to them, whether it's multiple tickets, whether it's being killed or anything in between, disproportionately happen to people that look like Senator Smith and I and the chief. And so we know that system over time erodes trust. And so it's part of growing up. Ike Leggett has talked about it many times. He got yelled at by a police officer putting up a sign in his last election. It's part of life, but it's part of the lived experience that I think is important in this conversation as well. But I am hopeful. I think we can get there. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think we can get there.
Well, thank you. And hope is important, especially when we're trying to change lives and change systems. Thank you. Thanks for being here this evening. We know you have to leave, and I will now turn things over to Senator Smith to respond to the rest of the conversation. Have a good evening, Councilmember Jawando. Senator Smith, thank you for giving him a chance to share his vision and his concerns. And so if I circle back to you, I know what your vision and your concern as well, which has prompted you to be a leader in the Senate as a senator, General Assembly, around these issues of legislative priorities around policing and police accountability.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. First, I want to say just thank you to everyone on the panel for all the amazing work you're doing and have done for years. It's really impressive, especially to hear that OLO report. We collect data, but not to that level of granularity on the state level for state police. And so it's inspiring, but it's also revealing and it's instructive. So just a shout out to our county government doing amazing work. So thank you all for your work. I'll say this, look, gatherings like this make me hopeful, and we've been doing a lot of this in the last couple of months. I wish we could be there in person, but I'm extremely optimistic about what we're about to do in the legislative session. I think we are with the confluence of events that have happened with the pandemic, economic downturn. We're in the midst of an election. We've got an election in 5 days. Obviously, we've got a new refocus and energy on racial reckoning and police reform. So I think this is a moment in time that is unlike what we've seen in several generations, frankly, since the 60s. And in Annapolis, I think that this provides us with a policy window that I think will only last, frankly, one session. And so my goal has been to make sure that we are as prepared as possible before we get into our slim 90-day session to make sure that we get meaningful reform passed. And that means consulting not only every stakeholder, but also talking to the members of the public who have frankly been coming down to Annapolis for years, pleading their case. So this has been a very comprehensive approach. It's not over with yet. We're still very much in the middle of it. And so I look forward to having that conversation. But back to your initial question, which was, in June, I wrote a letter in response to what happened to George Floyd. And that was really just to kickstart the process on the Senate side. The House had convened a work group, and they've been moving forward with some great recommendations under the Speaker's leadership and under Delegate Vanessa Atterbury from Howard County. But on the Senate side, we've had interim hearings, which are very rare. Hearings that don't occur during session are extremely rare, and that's because, as I've said in the letter, that for generations we've had a well-defined problem, and in many cases we've got well-defined solutions. What we've lacked is the political will to get them done. And like I said, it talked about that confluence of events. Now we are at the place where I think we can invoke and change things in a meaningful way. And so what you heard in those 15-hour plus sessions that we had over the course of 3 days was a discussion over 15 bills that ranged from independent investigations, use of force standards, access to public records, NPIA issues for personnel records with police misconduct, police training, uniform standards for training, a misconduct database, and obviously the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later this evening. What the conversations revealed is that not only is there renewed focus on this issue, but that we actually have the political will to get it done. And I think that a number of the issues will actually get done on a bipartisan, in a bipartisan manner. That's something different than in Annapolis than in the county. In the county, obviously, the struggle it's always a struggle to make to push forward with reform. And when you have a council that's all Democratic, you have a county executive that is arguably the most progressive county executive in the state, in the most progressive jurisdiction in the state, things have still been tough. So when we look toward the state, we have 24 jurisdictions, 141 delegates, 47 senators from the deepest blue to the deepest red. You understand the challenges that we face. So I think that one thing is to keep in mind is that we'll have a number of things that are bipartisan, but where the real rubber hits the road is where we're not going to have, where we're going to have an impasse. And we've got Democratic supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. And I'm confident that if there are decision points that we can't reach consensus, which I know that there will be, we'll move forward. And in this moment, we'll just make the right policy calls, focus purely on the merits of the legislation and make the right policy calls. So I'm extremely optimistic about what we face. Like I said, we've had a very comprehensive approach to this issue and to these issues. And so I just want to say hats off to everyone that's been involved thus far, and I'm looking forward to the discussion ahead. Councilmember Jawando did mention this, and I think it's really important, is that we've been focused on transparency, accountability, and interaction with law enforcement, with police accountability. But what I think gets lost in that discussion is how that the interconnectivity of so many things, like from transportation to housing to education, So as we have kind of we start to address and open the door to this conversation in the General Assembly, I want to make sure that we're still keenly focused on what I would call the phase 2, which is addressing some of the issues that deal with how and why law enforcement interact with our public in general. Do law enforcement officers, are they the right person to respond to a certain event? Do we have to look critically at decriminalizing certain behaviors so that law enforcement doesn't have to have that initial interaction? This gives us an opportunity to have those meaningful conversations under a new light. And so I'm also equally optimistic and excited about those opportunities. I could talk a lot about those as well. We've been developing those and we'll be dealing with those during our 90-day session. So I'll wrap with that and just say, again, thank you to everyone on the panel for your public service. It's really inspiring. And I think that in this moment, we have a real opportunity to just keep our head down and push for real reform in the state of Maryland and in Montgomery County. So I'm optimistic and excited for the opportunities ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering one more thing in terms of the kind of support you're getting overall in the state, because you talked about hoping to have this new bill ready when the Assembly reconvenes, and that you can work on seeing some meaningful change. And if you were to just describe it briefly, what meaningful change looks like for you, what are some key points that you feel that have to be there?
Sure, and I'll be candid with you. When we started our process, for the 3 days of hearings, you had one side saying, look, these reforms don't go nearly far enough. And then the other side said, hey, why are we focused on police accountability when we need to be keenly focused on crime in Baltimore City? We've just come off another record year of murders. So by the end of the 3 days, I think that we came to a point in which there was more consensus than we initially thought. Obviously, there are going to be some decision points we're just not going to be able to reach consensus. So to answer your specific question, for me, it deals with, I think that if you're going to restore trust in law enforcement, between law enforcement and the communities that they serve, you've got to have independent investigations of at least instances when someone is murdered or dies. You've got to have those independent investigations. We're thinking about nesting that responsibility either under the Office of State Prosecutor or the Attorney General's office. Also, use of force standards. It's got to be a uniform standard across the state for that. Training is obviously key. And then finally, I would say the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which the House and the Senate have both indicated that we are going to repeal. My warning to everyone is that, yes, we will repeal this, but let's be keenly focused on what comes next. We have 148 law enforcement agencies across the state. And if you repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, whatever those 148 jurisdictions or departments have on their books stays. So the repeal would have no effect whatever. And you would have a patchwork of due process and discipline throughout the state. So what I say is, let's repeal it. And we are going to repeal it. But let's be keenly focused on what comes next and building back better, to use an overused phrase, but build back better and understand that we can have a playing field in which no state employee or government employee on the municipal or county level has more or less due process than a law enforcement officer, but that there is due process there, and that you understand that every profession is unique, just as teachers have a slightly different process for discipline as firefighters do. So it's hard to get there. We're still working on it, but that's the end goal. So it's a long-winded answer of saying you got to have independent investigations on the front end, on the two tail ends, and the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights understand that we have a massive challenge there ahead to understand what we're going to build back in its place.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We're going to now give the Chief, Marcus Jones, an opportunity to respond to what he's heard. And I know that this is not an easy position for you to be in these days, and especially when there's so much talk about defunding and the police and improving community policing and police reform. So from your perspective, what are your concerns about what you're hearing in the community about the change that we need to see?
So good evening, Dr. Robertson, and thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to speak this evening. In policing, much of this discussion that what we are talking about, it's really not new to our profession, But I will say that the words of reform, which is, I think it comes at the right time for communities to really understand how policing should be done in their particular communities. People must always realize that policing is local. There are 18,000 police departments in this country. And every community doesn't look the same. Even here in Maryland, we can reasonably come to that conclusion that the city of Baltimore doesn't look like Montgomery County. And the issues that we have in Montgomery County, Baltimore City may not have the same types of issues. The approach to handle crime in those particular areas, the way that the community demands their law enforcement provide safety for is much different. So to have these safe communities, we must be able to work and have the respect and to have the partnership that I think is most important for us to be able to build. You know, in my 35-year career, it's very interesting to know that in order to have a really an understanding of each other, is that you have to have the understanding to listen to one another. And the one thing that we are saying in the police world today to all of our legislatures, all of our community members, is that we need to have the ability for us to be heard, as well as we need to listen. That's how we become more effective across the board. There's lots of discussion about police reform, of course, in Montgomery County. Right now, the county executive has a Reimagining Public Safety Task Force. It's a task force made up of nearly 80 individuals that has a dubious task of providing recommendations to the county executive literally in less than 4 months. The report is due in January of 2021 to make recommendations to the county executive. When I first took over as chief of police nearly 1 year ago, and in my confirmation period, one of the things I talked about with all of the discussion we had about accusations of racial profiling and other things that we do on our police department, the one thing I felt that transparency was important was to have an external audit. And I encouraged the county executive to push towards to have an external audit in order to be able to look at things such as data, as OLO has spoken about, in which they did their research, but to look at the data, but to look at information behind the data just as well. Just as it was noted in the report of OLO, is that it was noted that the information wasn't captured about the individuals that are stopped that come from outside of Montgomery County, with us being in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, as well as having a community of over 1.1 million residents, but to realize that we have a large amount of people who work here in Montgomery County who don't live here in Montgomery County. Montgomery County being one of those blossoming communities that we like to brag about, but we sometimes don't want to have that discussion in other important discussions that we should have about who is actually visiting our community in a positive way, as well as in some cases, individuals who come here with the intent to commit crimes. And we know that has been proven as a fact for well over time. So with that being said, as we work towards this police reform, again, looking at this audit, it gives us an opportunity to have an outside group that has been hired by the county executive, it's funded by the county council, to actually look at our organization from the top to the bottom, much of what Mr. Jawando spoke about earlier tonight, in response to many of the different facets of our department, as it comes to hiring, as it comes to promotion. One of the things I'll note in response to hiring, this past class that we just had, our recruit class, we had for the first time in our department's history, we have more minorities than a majority race of Caucasians that are in our class currently. That is a huge accomplishment. So we do focus on these things. And again, when we are having these discussions about promotion, when we're having these discussions about recruitment, Sometimes I find that individuals really are not coming to us, asking us the pertinent questions that need to be asked as we have these discussions. And I think that's what the audit is going to do in the long run. One of the things I think has been, again, there have been some, as we noted about the atrocious events that centered around George Floyd, which is, again, in my 35-year career, the worst thing I've ever seen done by any police officer to a human being. But the one thing I will say as a result of, in our community, we had 125 protests in our community. All of them were peaceful. And we allowed individuals to raise their voices, to march down some of our major roadways. There were no arrests out of those 125 protests that we had in our community. And I think that speaks volumes. It speaks volumes for our community, for our community members. We didn't have looting. We did not have any civil unrest. And I think it also speaks volumes for the police department. As I speak for the men and women, the 1,300 men and women who go out and put their lives on the line for this community each and every day. Again, accountability is important. It's important for me. I hold all of my officers accountable because I expect for them to have the utmost amount of respect of when they deal with individuals each and every day. Racial profiling has always been something that during the course of my career, particularly when we had the Department of Justice back in the late 90s that actually did a review, in the mid 90s that actually did a review of this department, but also talked about the racial stops and how they came to the determination that, again, when we looked at the data, again, there was no focus on external customers, you might say, or residents that lived outside of Montgomery County, and that report was telling in so many ways. As we talk about, for example, and one of the things I wanted to raise, for example, we talk about grabbing the data and having certain data sets put in and asking about ethnicity. We in the police department have never asked individuals what their race or ethnicity is during the course of my career. In fact, we always found that to be an offensive thing that the community did not want. Now, if the community now turns and says we want this differently, then that's a discussion that we would have. We actually have left it up to, and I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but we have always, for traffic stop data, that data has actually been mandated and captured by our state partners in our state system as we write citations that fall under the state, the annotated code, traffic article, I'm sorry. So with that being said, those individuals that we would classify in a race category, again, either the data is placed on the individual's driver's license or the officer has to make a determination. We do not, in our policy, ask individuals what is their race/ethnicity, nor do we ask them which country do they originate from. Again, because we've had major concerns in the immigrant community about, again, scaring our immigrant communities into us beginning to ask questions about undocumented individuals in our community. So we have to be very careful. And so I'll leave with this because I know there are many questions. But again, when we look at issues within our communities, when we look at crime in our communities, and I can always say this, is that I can say that sometimes when we look at our high crime areas in the county, and I can show all throughout Montgomery County, I can give you the exact areas where I know we've had what we call hotspots. These are where we have most of our shootings, most of our homicides, most of our robberies, our most serious crimes that occur at these corridors in the Silver Spring community. In each police district, I can show you the Wheaton community, which corridor, the Georgia Avenue corridor, I can show you that. Where we have always put our resources is in order to be able to make those areas safe again. And that's something that I can say in regards to the safety in this community, which is high on our on our radar because that's our mission. That's what we have to do, is to maintain a safe community. We speak about things such as on traffic stops where we seized an incredible amount of handguns. And this year has been unprecedented in the amount of handguns that we've received, that we've actually recovered on traffic stops, illegally possessed handguns. And so these are the things behind data that we must also talk about in order to keep our community safe. And I'll leave with this, and I think it's vitally important that we all in the community have a role to play. The issues where we have individuals, and again, all problems that lie within our community are not police problems. Some of these things are from an economic standpoint, from a housing standpoint, that sometimes, again, gets rolled into the police being the final authority. As Senator Smith noted, about we get sometimes pushed into having to be the final authority. One of the things that I have been really vocal about is that the government has failed the mental health community in a large way for many years. And the police department has been saddled with handling many individuals who go through mental health crisis on each and every day. 6 years ago, I went back to as a commander of the Silver Spring Station. I had never seen such a high volume of mental health calls of service during the entire course of my career. And that continues today. And I will say, I agree with Senator Smith, that there comes a time when there needs to be ownership from others. Again, when you have a mental health situation that involves individuals who are not a danger to themselves or not a danger to others, that those individuals should have the services from the mental health professionals, and they should be the ones responding to those calls. That is something I definitely would like to get rid of. But the other thing that I will also make sure that we realize is that we will not be out of the mental health responsive business. There are times when there are situations where there is violence associated with that particular call for service, or there is a dangerous weapon, and that we must respond to those calls. What I will say, training is vitally important. We continue to work and train in a way and to improve our training in our handling of calls for service, particularly with individuals going through mental health crisis. I want to give our officers every opportunity because we really do want to preserve life. We do not go into these encounters with the intent to take someone's life. Officers struggle tremendously. Those who have been involved in officer-involved shootings or any other type of incident where an individual dies. That is very detrimental on an officer's personal life and his family life. And that is something that they do not, this is the one thing, again, from an educational standpoint, that we want to make sure that the community knows that we're from the human race. And people need to make sure that that is very clear. All police officers don't act the same. We come from different backgrounds. We are very diverse. We have different responses sometimes to events. Something that I may be a threat to me, may not necessarily be a threat to another officer. And there's a variety of reasons. It may be the size of the individual. There's a lot of other things that go into that. What we want to do is to provide our officers with the best tools possible to make sure that they can maintain and deconflict, most importantly, any particular situation to the best of their ability in order to bring situations down. And I'll finish with this, is that I will say that in those situations, much of what you don't see the success stories of our officers who actually do deconflict in many of these types of cases. And why is that? Well, the only reason I can give you is because the media doesn't cover those stories. Those are not the good stories to be told. And that's not the fault of law enforcement, but I will tell you that I can see many times that our officers who actually do a very good job of making sure that people who in their worst times are sometimes going through these crises, that we do take care of them and get them the necessary help that they need at the time that they need it. So I'll pause there. I'm sure there are many questions to come, But thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move quickly now to our community representatives here. And we've got Reverend Dr. Sterling King from the NAACP, and he's the Director of Religious Affairs there. We also have Jamie Bazen with a new group called the Racial Justice Coalition. And what I want to do is have them back to back to share a little bit about what they do and their concerns about policing. And of course, the NAACP has had a historic role in that. And then we'll let them speak, and then we'll try to come back to all of our panelists, and particularly you, Chief Jones, because I know there have been some comments and some questions that we may want to ask you. So Dr. King, and then he'll be followed by Jamie Bazen with the Racial Justice Coalition. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you. Greetings to all, and it's good to see such a wonderful, diverse panel gathered to discuss such a very important issue. I'm just reminded of the psychological theorem that says that human behavior tends to confirm human assumptions. And I thought that the comment that Councilman Jawando made about his recent experience with law enforcement just reinforces that. He said that as he was stopped right off the bat, sort of, at least as I interpreted it, the policeman asked him if he had drugs or a gun. And I say that to say this, and we'll speak to the NAACP in a moment. I think that by and large, the majority of the whites who are serving in law enforcement, this is not all now, I quite agree with the chief, but by and large, the majority of the whites who are serving in law enforcement activity in this nation, in the state of Maryland and Montgomery County, in fact, have the assumption that when they come into a situation that involves a Black, whether it's a youth or an adult of almost any age or stage of life, they tend to assume that they're coming into a zone of danger. And therefore, their behavior tends to sort of support that. Human behavior will confirm human assumptions. If you assume that I'm going to be dealing with a thug or somebody who might put my life at risk, I'm going to employ certain either verbal or other behaviors to confirm that. And that's a real tragedy. And that kind of ties back in with something that goes beyond what perhaps I think tonight's session is about, something called post-traumatic slavery. We talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's something called post-traumatic slavery disorder. And that post-traumatic slavery disorder involves both the one who was enslaved and the one who was doing the enslaving. And we as a nation are still suffering from that. So the NAACP, when it was organized back in 1909, this was part of the history and the heritage. Sure, the NAACP has been on the front lines of fighting for social justice in this nation since the early 1900s. And I'm reminded somewhat of it's a bit of a paradox, that notion that says that we're doing better, and yet at the same time we're getting worse. Now that's not, you look at some of the great forces that are at play here, and then we have to some extent, some positive countervailing forces. But we have people who are in the highest form of echelons of government talking about, quote, law and order and what they would do and what they see as, quote unquote, the reason or the way of solving and resolving these issues. And what that does, I think, among other things, that it helps to kind of reinforce something that is already there. Human behavior will confirm human assumptions. And this is based upon some empirical research. People have been put in classroom situations where they are told that you got the dummies in your class. And sure enough, based upon their empirical test scores and all, they were not the low achievers, they were the high achievers. By the end of the session of that semester, or whatever it was, they'd been dumbed down. So, okay, now coming back to the NAACP, I think we, as an organization, have been and continue to be very much concerned about and involved with these issues. And that's not just the officers of the organization, but also the membership. The membership is very diverse membership, and it's very widely distributed here in the county and the state and the nation. all of what I just said notwithstanding, I am a perennial optimist. And I believe that despite all of the negative rhetoric that we're hearing, and we're hearing a lot of it, hopefully after next week, some of it will be toned down. But I hope that we as individuals, regardless of where you stand on whatever issue, that we will begin to kind of reclaim some of our humanity that I think has been injured in recent months, some would say almost recent years. But, and so we have to, as I speak now from sort of from an ecclesiastical point of view, I'm a retired pastor. I pastored a church in Montgomery County for 28 years. I taught at Howard University for 34 years. So I've had the opportunity to work with a very diverse audience of people over the years. And so I said I'm a perennial optimist because I believe that despite the efforts of many, and there are some very powerful people who are trying to kind of pull us back, if you will, not just here in Montgomery County, but as a nation. I mean, the efforts in this whole voter suppression thing, all of these things tie into what we talk about here in Montgomery County. So we have to be very vigilant. I think every person on this panel tonight and each of the 55 people who are now listening in, we all have a role in this. And so I'm a perennial optimist, despite all of the bad things that we hear and some of the things that we've seen. I think we're very blessed to have Chief Marcus Jones as the Chief of Police here in Montgomery County. I think his presence, and this is very important. It's something Senator Smith said also earlier. I mean, I'm going to be 80 years old in a couple of days if the Lord wills. And I tell you, there's a saying that you see, the victor never remembers and the victim never forgets. I personally have had some encounters with the police down in my home state of Arkansas. I did some work in Mississippi and South Carolina, other places. And the point of it is that, these things are still in my mind. I mean, I just, even when I, on my knees in prayer to God, forgive me, get it out of my mind. Then I see a police car, pass down the street. Oh, I happen to be driving down the street and I see one or two police cars and a guy, there's a person over there. And these images sort of surge back, the victim never forgets. The victor never remembers. Where do we go? What do we do? How do we move forward? With much prayer and much focused insight. I think the kind of information that was presented through this Office of Legislative Oversight is very pertinent. Again, I want to just be on record of commending our Chief of Police in Montgomery County. I think it's really good. His presence is a tone setter in a lot of positive ways, and we need more of this kind of representation. Listen, I'm not supposed to preach tonight.
Right. So Dr. King, yes, I know.
If I were going to do that, I guess my sermon topic would be that we have a future ahead of us that is better than our present and the past. And so everyone who has participated and is participating in this panel tonight, and everyone who's listening in, each and every one of us must play a role to help to move us collectively towards the point where we want to be. Because we still hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice. And we are still working as a nation to form a more perfect union. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're still working towards that. And again, when I see some of the positive examples here, just using Chief Jones as an example, of course, Senator Smith and Councilman Jawando, Dr. Robinson, what more could I say?
Well, thank you so much. And I'm glad that you are an optimist, because some folks aren't that optimistic about what is going on, whether it's policing or other things in this country. So I'm going to move quickly to Jamie. And but before then, someone has said happy birthday. So we don't want to forget that. Thank you for telling us about this milestone in your life. So let me say happy birthday, and others might want to say it in the chat box as well.
Thank you.
So Jamie, would you share with us a little about the Racial Justice Coalition?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I co-lead the Social Justice and Immediate Action subgroup of the Racial Justice Coalition, which is a new organization within Montgomery County made up of several church congregations who came together following the Mother Emanuel massacre in 2015, but are now more formally known as the Racial Justice Coalition following George Floyd's death. The coalition is decentralized and organized into 4 different subgroups. Mine is the one focusing in part on policing. And we've only just begun to scratch the surface of what we'd like to do regarding police reform. We've been able to meet virtually with several local police chiefs, including Chief Jones, to discuss how departments are handling racial justice issues. And in those discussions, we learned how important the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights is and how it serves as a barrier to accountability for police officers. So we wrote a letter to our congregations and to our communities detailing this issue and asking that they contact their representatives. We are hoping in the future to have another meeting with everyone that we've already spoken with to kind of determine what our role would specifically be in building and maintaining a police service that reflects and best supports our community. If you have further questions or if you'd like to join my group or any of the other subgroups, you can email the Racial Justice Coalition at gmail.com. And thank you again for letting me speak. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And we're pleased to know that your group is a group that is working with a number of faith communities to address this issue. We have a number of statements and questions that are in the chat box and the Q&A. And so we'll probably want to circle back to a few of those, but I wanted to actually go back to the police chief and also to the senator, because at the senator, you mentioned the word trust, and we know that there are some areas of trust that need to be mended. And so I'm wondering if our chief could talk about how or any efforts he may be doing, or how he's working on trying to build the trust between particularly African-American communities and other communities that have really been the victims, as Dr. King alluded to, of some of this misconduct, some of these issues of divisions in the community. And Senator Smith, you can also, if you have a question or comment to make to the chief. So Chief Jones.
So yes, so again, having partnerships in the community and doing outreach in the community is vitally important in order to be able to build trust. And again, we have historically had relationships with different groups across the county and relationships with those groups to discuss police matters. Groups such as the NAACP that we worked with for years, and Casa de Maryland as an example, a couple of those organizations that are well vested within our communities. But we've also had to develop other relationships through our community with youth groups, with other types of groups throughout the county, as well as really when we look at our engagement, we really look to expand that engagement with all of our police districts by having different types of policing programs, community policing programs, and to discuss these issues that are impacted. And for example, over the past few months, after the George Floyd incident and many of the protests, we had many young African Americans, and when I say young, I mean in their mid-30s and even younger, who began to have dialogues with us and wanted to talk and really sit down. And we sat down with them virtually during this COVID crisis to really have great discussions and to hear from them what are some of their major concerns about interacting with policing, and we were able to answer lots of their questions, and to give them really direction if they had, if they felt like they were, had a bad interaction with the police officer, a police officer did something wrong. Because the only way that we can fix any given problem, if we have issues with any of our officers or sort of the system being systematic, we have to have the information before us so that we can begin to figure out how to address these types of situations. Police accountability for me is highly important. I look at that and I take it very seriously. My staff knows this to be true. It is something that we have to resonate throughout the entire organization in order to be able to build that trust, to make sure that we're holding our officers accountable to the best of our ability. And it's something, again, as I know with Senator Smith, as the work that he's doing with the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, but there's still these challenges when you talk about due process. We want to give officers those due process, but we also want to make sure that we can hold those officers accountable and have the community's trust in doing so.
Senator Smith, would you like to make a comment?
Sure. I'll what the chief just said is I think really important with respect to the community policing aspect. I mean, I had an opportunity a few weeks ago to go up to Baltimore City to kind of personally observe one of the violence interruption programs that unfortunately didn't get funded this year. We passed it, but it got vetoed, and that's a long story. But the point is that I got a chance to go in and observe what their work was. And these were folks that are former offenders that have now, come home, and they're now dedicated toward, addressing some of those issues and getting into their communities and interrupting that chain and that system of violence. And two things that they told me that really resonated with me was that the Baltimore City Police Department were their critical partners. They relied on the Baltimore City Police Department to understand who these high risk individuals were, but then also to be called on to interrupt that potential instance of violence before the police did. So the police would see if something happening, they would observe, they would call, and there would be a kind of a community-based approach to de-escalate a situation before law enforcement had to get formally involved. But then second, and probably more importantly, is that he said that, in certain areas, and this is true actually throughout all of our communities, but in certain areas it's certainly true, is that more than any other instrumentality of government, law enforcement, police are more visible and interact more closely and more intimately with our general public than any other instrumentality of government. And as someone in elected office, that really resonated with me. And so when you're talking about restoring trust, it's not only that community involvement and that community policing model that we need to get back to, but it's also just clear rules of the road and transparency. And what I mean by that is if you have clear use of force standards, there's some clear lines of training, and there's clear methods of accountability. Those are clear lines of the road. And then also for transparency, if you've got independent investigations, if you've got a misconduct database, then you are going to restore trust in the general public with their law enforcement agencies, with the understanding that if an officer has been or has a pattern of misconduct, that yes, we've given the chief the latitude to address that situation adequately, but then also, yes, the general public will have access to those instances and those records of misconduct. And so it's a comprehensive approach, but I'd say, one is understanding that our law enforcement, more than any other instrumentality of government, interfaces with the general public. And that's something that should resonate with all of us. And then one is, look, clear rules of the road, and two is transparency. So that's what we're aimed at, and that's what we're focused on during the General Assembly. And I think we're going to make some tremendous progress working with law enforcement and community groups.
One other question I do have, and I see it alluded to in the chat box, and it has to do with this topic, has basically about defunding the police or redirecting resources. And I know that that's an important question, and I would also want to get the police chief's response, because I'm not so sure how he responds to that, because many groups in the community and many legislative changes are looking at the resources that are spent on policing and law enforcement, how they're spent. And I'm wondering, Chief Jones, how do you respond when you hear defunding or redirecting resources?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting conversation. I think I'd rather really talk about redirecting resources, you might say, than we talk about the so-called defund the police, because I don't think defund the police has been really clearly defined. And so I'll give an example. If we think we're taking taking a police budget, taking money from that budget, and then placing it over to another agency, as any community has to redirect that, and therefore you lose, for example, staffing as a result of it, because there has to be cuts to a budget. I have a large budget. Granted, I have $280+ million budget, but 83% of my budget goes to personnel costs, salaries, and benefits. That means 17% of the rest of my budget goes to operating costs. And one of the things that I always stress in operating costs is the investment in training. And to me, it is vitally important that you provide the best training possible in order to have the best police department possible. If you don't invest in training, I promise you, your police department will be lacking in its services to the community members as they demand. And so I think that's a very slippery slope. And I would encourage people to really think differently. That's already been tried in Minneapolis as a result of George Floyd. And their murder rates have gone through the roof because they've got less officers today than they had when when that incident occurred, over 100+ less officers today. But their murder rate has spiked nearly up to close to 50% higher than it was last year. And that's something the community must be aware of. The other part I would just say, when we talk about redirecting, is very similar to what I talked about when we talk about where we are in this reimagining public safety. We really have to really talk about, and we are, in many of these groups that I have already spoke about, and Councilmember Jawando also spoke about with the commission that's been placed, is that's what's being looked at. That's what we're taking a deeper dive. And I've already given my opinion on where we are in the mental health world. Well, we really do need to have a deeper look at others coming in, and that discussion has already begun. Right now, I know that there was money allocated and for Health and Human Services to create more mobile crisis teams that could go out to be able to handle some of these mental health calls, that could take some of that off of our plates. But that's only one faction of policing. When you look at patrol, which is our largest bureau, those are our first responders answering the calls for service each and every day. But that's only a fraction of what our police department does in its entirety of functionality. And there are lots of other needs in this that we need to address when it comes to other public safety needs in our community. That, again, when I look at managing the budget, do I have the personnel in order to be able to provide those services? And if you take money away, then therefore you're going to take some services away as well.
Senator Smith, how do you respond to that? I know language is important, and you certainly, in your role in the state, you're always mindful of expenditures and where monies are channeled. How do you respond to the chief's answer about the defunding language versus redirecting?
No, I think we're actually pretty much in alignment on that. I mean, look, I understand that the defund movement exists on a spectrum from folks that are abolitionists to folks that are, and I think where most of the folks are, is reimagining and reallocating resources. And that's where I fall. I've personally just refrained from using the phrase. I mean, I respect it and I respect those that use it, but personally for me, just in my position and from my perspective, That phrase is too easily weaponized in the environment that I operate in, which is a very partisan operation at the state level. You have Republicans, Democrats, you have people that are law and order, people that are abolitionists. So just for me personally, it's something that's too easily weaponized and not precise enough. So my focus has been on the reallocation and reimagining. Like we are asking our law enforcement officers to do way too much. And I literally, to the officer, I've never had a conversation with an officer that says, hey, look, I enjoy responding to someone having a mental health crisis, or that I'm adequately prepared, frankly. But just as a law enforcement officer is not the right person to respond to someone having a mental health crisis, so too a social worker is not the right person to respond to someone breaking into your house at night. So you have to understand that there's a balance. But like, again, in this moment that we're in, we have an opportunity to kind of look at things through a different lens. A lot of folks that haven't been engaged or haven't been focused on this subject matter are now locked in, and we can have a real conversation as a community as to where we really need to reallocate funding, and so that we have an opportunity, we have a political will, and all the eyes of our communities and the state are watching us. So this is, my call. We do have the fierce urgency of now, at our backs, and it's, we have an opportunity at the state level in January to act, and I'm confident that we will. But for me, I focused more on the methods and the processes and the ideas of reallocating resources so that we have a more effective and community-based approach to solving problems.
Thank you, and I know that this is the kind of conversation that is ongoing, and many of us are now, recognizing how important it is to have a global meeting that the whole community being involved, and especially for African Americans, there has been this unique experience with the police departments. Here or around the country. And I know when you mentioned, Senator, that it is the one institution, shall we say, that has had the most visibility and communication with so many people in any community. And I would say for some Black and Brown communities, we may see the police showing up more often than in other communities. And we've witnessed these challenges throughout our history in this country. So it is an important issue, especially if we're talking about equity or moving forward. There are some difficult conversations that need to be had around race. And sort of as we close, I know that you talked about those injustices, and that sort of, are a result of our racial history, and sort of helping people to be honest about that and to recognize it. Because when you think about Councilmember Jawando, I mean, he's pulled over all the time, and what is that about? So that's something that we all have to recognize.
Absolutely. I mean, our racial history and heritage and the tragedy of our history permeates every aspect and every institution of our society. I mean, look at education, even in Montgomery County right now. I was not here last summer, but I watched and I caught up to speed about the conversations that were happening about school zoning and students being kind of literally bussed across school districts, and parents in this progressive community that we have having these really raw conversations out in public, which to me was fascinating that people were able to be that upfront about it. From education to housing, we still, until we passed the bill just this past session, you could still discriminate based on, for housing, based on someone's legal source of income, to include that all important Section 8 voucher. And so we have so many of these legacies that are still with us very much today, and law enforcement and their interactions and their communications and their systems, just one aspect of that. And so I think that we understand that this is a global approach, that it's not just, this problem doesn't just exist within the sphere of our interactions with law enforcement. I think that we'll be better and more well equipped to solve our problems that are multifaceted. So look, it informs almost everything we do, and the data that was the data points that the OLO report that were articulated earlier today, and then the data that we were able to grasp from our state level recording mechanisms show that there's disparate treatment and disparate interaction with law enforcement and communities of color. It's no mistake, and it's no secret. And so it's incumbent upon us as lawmakers to do something about it, and as community members to make our voices heard. And I think that we have a unique opportunity to amplify that message in a way that people are paying more attention to. I'll just say this, people have drawn a lot of parallels from today into 1968. You had a volatile presidential, assassinations. You even had a flu that was a national flu that was ravaging our country. And you had a nationwide unrest and a racial reckoning, an instance of racial reckoning. I think perhaps what's different this time around, and probably a more important distinction, is that the response today has been more multiracial, multi-generational than perhaps it was in 1968. And that should be something that is encouraging to all of us. Folks across the spectrum, people that have never been involved in activism before are now engaged. White folks are engaged. Black folks are engaged. Brown folks are engaged. So it's something that potentially is a silver lining on all of this, that those highlighted instances of police misconduct and the murder of George Floyd most recently to make those national headlines has given us all an opportunity to refocus and to kind of realize that a lot of the problems that have been with us for generations are still very much top of mind for a lot of people moving through society every day. And so if we have an opportunity to address a few of those things in this moment in time, I think that's a positive thing. But it's a keen reminder that we've got so much more work to do, even in 2020.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as we prepare to close, I want to just go back to the Office of Legislative Oversight and their report. And I want to ask you, Natalia and Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, are there any follow-up reports that you need? I mean, you're asking for a lot of data that does not exist, and you're recommending that the police department do X, Y, Z. But do you have a follow-up report or a follow-up plan?
Thanks for that question. So we actually have some projects underway in this current work program that are looking at other aspects of policing in terms of trying to understand the interconnect between 311 and 911 calls in terms of requests for services and emergency services. We're also doing a project that's looking at other jurisdictions that have taken traffic enforcement out of the police department and have other entities that are administering that, again, to help sort of inform this reimagining policing work. Natalia, is there anything else that we're doing that I've missed?
Going back to the 911 and the 311 calls, I'm working on a study on public safety responses to mental health situations. So that's going to look at specifically at the ways in which public safety, including police and fire and rescue, respond to crises in the community, and as well as the other resources that the county has for those situations.
And I forgot to mention one more thing that we're doing in OLO. As part of the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act, our office has been charged to do racial equity and social justice impact statements for legislation introduced on or after August 1st. And so we have a few impact statements already prepared, and we'll be doing an impact statement on that Councilmember Jawando beginning of this forum.
Thank you.
Robinson, if I could just.
I did see in the chat. Oh, Dr. King, did you want to make a comment?
I just wanted to acknowledge that our branch president, Ms. Linda Plummer, when I saw her here, so I don't know if you were aware of the fact that she was on. We're just delighted to have her with us as well. Ms. Linda Plummer is the president of the Montgomery County branch of NAACP. We're thankful for her presence.
Thank you. I saw one comment in the chat box that someone was sort of responding to the call for this aggregate data around race and indicating, is there other category a catch-all when no ethnicity is listed. And I'm not so sure if this comment is alluding to, do we need that aggregated data? Do we need those categories? Or do we need some category for looking at when nothing is checked? How do you respond to that?
Sure, I can respond to that. So as Chief Jones mentioned, the police department does not, when they conduct a traffic stop, officers do not ask the driver to state their race or ethnicity. It's based on the officer's observation. And also the state law that requires the collection of these data specifies the categories that are used. And so if the other category would be kind of a person that the officer perceives not to fit into any of the other categories that are required to be gathered. And so specifically the categories that are required are Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native American, other, and white.
Thank you. We have had a very engaging and enriching conversation, and we really do appreciate the fact that we had an audience here that was stood by right from the beginning to the end. And we really want to say a thank you to Senator Smith, Councilmember Jawando, Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, as well as Natalia Carrizosa. And we have Jamie Bazen and from the Racial Justice Coalition, of course, Reverend Dr. King from the NAACP. There will be more to come, I'm sure, more conversations that perhaps Interfaith Works will initiate and conduct, but I know that around the county, we're going to still see more, because this is a topic that I think really hits home in terms of where we want to go, not only reimagining public safety, but reimagining a community where there is justice for all. Thank you so much, and hope you all have a great evening. And we hope to invite you to another Zoom on the next time. Thank you. Bye-bye. And thank you to our audience. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Happy birthday, Reverend King.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday,
Happy
Reverend King.
birthday.
Happy 80th.